IDC Radio.
בינתחומי.
106.2 FM.
הרדיו הבינתחומי.
IDC Radio. In collaboration with כל ישראל.
106.2 FM.
ריסק, סדר עולמי חדש, עם תומי שטיינר.
You are listening to 106.2 radio, broadcasting from the Sammy Ofer School of Communications here at IDC Herzliya. IDC Radio is celebrating its third anniversary, and I'm welcoming you to Risk, a conversation on politics, strategy and diplomacy in the 21st century. My name is Tommy Steiner. I'm with the Institute for Policy and Strategy here at IDC. And I'm joined today, and I'm honored to be joined today, by Ambassador Dr. Oded Eran from the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. Oded, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Tommy.
Today's show is produced by Omer Kedar, who is also our technician. The music editor is Barak Chaimovich. Sasha Mityakov and Lior Peleg are in charge of the video recording and editing. You can also follow us on 106.2 FM, on 106.2 FM COIL, and segments of the show will be posted on the YouTube channel of IDC Radio. And with that, I think I've wrapped up all the introductions that I need to do. I'll briefly introduce Oded. Oded, first of all, is a distinguished Israeli diplomat. He is now a senior research associate at the Institute for National Security Studies, where he also served as its director from July 2008 through November 2011. Before joining the Institute for National Security Studies, Dr. Eran served as the World Jewish Congress representative in Israel and as its Secretary General of the Congress's branch in Israel. He led, as I said, a distinguished career in the Israeli Foreign Service. His last post was Israel's ambassador to the European Union, where he was also Israel's representative to NATO. Prior to that, he served as Israel's ambassador to Jordan. He headed Israel's negotiation team with the Palestinians during Ehud Barak's prime ministership, and he held quite a few and rather important posts at the Foreign Service, including Deputy Director General for Economic Affairs and the Deputy Chief of Mission at our embassy in Washington. Today he also is the advisor to the Knesset Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs, and he holds a PhD from the London School of Economics. Oded, did I miss anything?
Well, you can repeat it because it was so nice to hear my rich career. Thank you.
No. Honestly, I want to start with a very general question before we get into the issues at stake. We'll be discussing Iran, obviously. We can't do that without that. We're also going to be talking about Jordan and Egypt, and then we'll talk about our relations with the United States and with Europe, two countries that you have followed our relations with them for quite some time. But before going into that, a sort of a personal, professional question. Considered to be one of Israel's top diplomats, aren't you sometimes frustrated that Israel lacks a foreign policy?
Israel lacks many things, among them foreign policy, but related to your question is the whole question of strategic concept on many issues concerning foreign policy, concerning defense, concerning the relationship between defense and foreign policy. And it is very frustrating on the one hand, but very a cause for concern, because you need to have a concept. You need also to have the flexibility to adjust it to changing circumstances, such as those that we witness in the Middle East. And so there is a need, I think, for a conceptual vision of Israel's relations with the environment, the international environment, and I am afraid that we are only now beginning to construct one. There are efforts by the Foreign Ministry and other related agencies to do this, and I hope that they will come up with some sort of more comprehensive.
Well, it will be anyway an improvement because we don't have one at this point.
Right.
I think we are the only Western democracy that hasn't got one. Broadly speaking, I can't think of any normal country in the world that doesn't have one.
Well, maybe we don't deserve the title normal in this sense.
Yes, you're being optimistic, I know.
No, I'm serious, because we are in a... I don't think that we are in a unique situation, but we are in a very peculiar situation that we are a sort of an island, a political island in an environment with which we have a conflict and we haven't settled it. We don't belong really, politically speaking, to Europe, although I invested many of my years in doing it. And so we need to have the flexibility to move between the various blocks, the international blocks and regions and associations. But we need to have a concept. Where do we really want to invest? How do we cope with the region? How do we cope with the emerging powers in the Far East? And I think it's about time that we should have this.
Well, on this optimistic note, we'll take our first break. And we're back. I'm Tommy Steiner. Welcome back to Risk. I'm here today with Ambassador Dr. Oded Eran. Let's jump into the issues. We're going to talk about Iran for a moment. And I think particularly we will focus on the Western handling of Iran's march to nuclear weapons. Honestly, I have to say that if people would have asked me, I would say a year ago, or perhaps less, whether Europe would impose such severe sanctions beyond what was decided in the United Nations Security Council, I would have probably said no, that's not going to happen, not such severe sanctions. But, I'm happy to stand corrected. Were you surprised?
Mildly, because I saw for many years the European responsible behavior on this issue. And I think that they have acted, first of all, in unison and unity, in the sense that on many other issues they can't find the way to operate together. But on this issue, they overcame the individual members' policies and they act together. Secondly, indeed, the sanctions which they already adopted and those that will come into force on the 1st of July, they are very important. There is a slight gap, though, between the adoption of the resolution and the implementation of the sanctions that they themselves adopted. But by and large, they are a very important force in this, and indeed they lead the 5+1 negotiation with Iran, which is very important. I think that this unity between the various members of this team, basically the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany, this is very important. And for the time being, the Iranians attempt to drive a wedge between these 6 is not working. But Europe is very important in this respect, and I think that they deserve the credit.
But there has been a lot of criticism over the performance of Lady Ashton over the past few years. She's Vice President of the European Commission and also responsible for foreign policy. Won't go into a long title. But when you compare her performance, her handling of the issue, to her predecessor, Javier Solana, don't you miss him?
I miss him because we had many hours of conversations on this particular issue, and he was still very knowledgeable because he was a physicist dealing with nuclear stuff, and he knew exactly what was at stake. But when I look at the results and of the negotiations, and when I look at the professionalism with which the issue is dealt by the Europeans, and when I look at other components, I think that Lady Baroness Ashton is doing quite a good job. And the negotiations today are in an advanced position. We, of course, have to wait to see what will happen in the next round in Moscow in a couple of, basically it's 10 days.
Yeah.
And I think that she's doing, on this particular issue, she's doing quite a good job. She has a very good team. I think you and I know the lady who helps Ashton, Helga Schmidt, who also runs sort of a separate course of line of negotiations with the
senior
Iranian
officials.
Yes, and so this team is working quite well, given the fact that they come from different nations in Europe with different agendas, and so. Solana was very knowledgeable and deserves full respect, but the team right now is doing a relatively good job.
Talking about Moscow and its and upcoming to Moscow, it's hard. This is, I guess, in competition. Do you think that the Iranians are starting to yield to the international pressure, or they don't really believe that time has come for them to yield?
I think that the meeting in June is crucial because if nothing is achieved, actually, that the Iranians don't make any concession and there's no agreement on any point, the Iranians can say to themselves, we have the summer because there is the sacred holiday to which everyone in Europe and the United States goes. And then comes
the
vacances, and then comes the elections in the United States. And the assumption, rightly or wrongly, is that 2 weeks before the elections, the president is not going to plunge into some sort of a military operation in Iran. And then comes the winter, and the Iranians can look at the horizon of 6-7 months in which they have almost a free hand to make progress in their plans. And so if there is no agreement whatsoever on any of the issues at stake, this is a serious situation. So I have to believe that the Iranians, and we have to remember that some of the sanctions will go into effect on the 1st of July.
Yes.
July. So if in June there is no progress whatsoever, the Iranians cannot even ask, which they did in the first 2 rounds. They already asked and put pressure on the 6th to relax the sanctions and certainly to avoid those coming into effect. So I have to believe, and there are many reports about effectiveness of the sanctions and the fact that they are beginning to bite, and there are economic pressures. And so I have to believe that the Iranians in this coming round are going to propose something. It may not be necessarily acceptable, but they are going to put a concrete set of proposals.
Because if not, all hell will break loose.
And then combined with the reports about a third enrichment plant, which a respectable institute in Washington came out with a couple of days ago, and other sort of discoveries, quote unquote, and revelations about the Iranian project, I think that they will put themselves in a very serious situation.
The Europeans might even turn the other way if Israel takes its own action, in other words.
Well, that's a different question, I think. Who takes the action? what will be the level of cooperation between Israel and mostly the United States on these issues. And I think that there are still some gray areas where there is no full understanding on every detail, and this is an issue which you cannot leave in this situation. You need to have a full agreement on almost every detail.
Thank you. You're back to Risk. I'm Tommy Steiner here at IDC Radio, celebrating its 3rd anniversary. And I'm joined today by Ambassador Dr. Oded Eran. We talked about Iran. Now we're going to come a bit closer to Israel and talk about our surrounding neighborhood, particularly Egypt and Jordan, their fate and their relations with Israel. And I just have to mention at this point that one of the props of this program is this board game, diplomacy. And I've been asked more than once, how is this relevant? Because it depicts actually Europe in the 19th century. How is it relevant to these days? Well, coming to the Middle East and something called, we're starting to be in a multipolar Middle East, I think it is ever more relevant. The only problem is that, Oded, we don't have a Metternich in the Middle East, just to make sure that things get a bit better. But talking about Egypt and Jordan, Jordan is a country you served in also. But let's start with Jordan. Are you concerned?
I am concerned. I am concerned not only about Jordan, but the rest of the Middle East, and the things are connected. Because what we have seen ever since the breakout of the what is called the Arab Spring, there is the strengthening of the fundamentalist forces in the region, both in North Africa and the eastern side of the Mediterranean, and the rise of governments, not only parties, which belong to the same category. We have seen it in a mild way in Tunisia. We are seeing it as we speak in Egypt, and we see the beginnings of something similar in Jordan, though on a lesser level. And things are shaping up in the same way also in Turkey, with which we have very tense relations, and it's a sort of a separate category. But the political map, the geopolitical map that we used to see until 2011 is changing in front of our eyes, and we need to come out. Israel has to come out with some sort of a strategy of how to deal with it. We will face with a serious situation soon with Egypt, in my view, when the new government and maybe even the new president, because they are going to the second round and the final round in 10 days, and we will see what happens there. The new regime in Egypt may want to reopen the 1979 agreement between the Treaty of Peace, especially the military annex, because they will say this is a limitation on Egypt's sovereignty, and we would like to, not to abrogate the treaty, certainly not unilaterally, but we would like to review it. And Israel will have to face this demand and deal with them. What the result that will come from such negotiations or renegotiations will impact the rest of the Middle East, and this is very important, because if we can reach an agreement between Israel and Egypt,
a radical
regime in Egypt, this will send a signal to the rest of the regimes in the region, and this is very important and will be very positive. However...
But you don't really believe that will be so easy to do?
It won't be easy, but the new Egyptian regime is also constrained not only by the demands of the streets, so to say, but also by the demands to feed 85 million Egyptians.
Or as we like to put it, the addition of 1 million mouths every 9 months.
Absolutely. And so the relations with the West, quote-unquote, the United States, Europe, and the various economic institutions, IMF, World Bank, and the new role which the EBRD has.
The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development.
Thank you, Tommy.
You're welcome.
These institutions and states are very important to any regime in Egypt. So they also have to look at the wider map. So, but if we can reach this agreement, this will be a very important sort of addition in the strategy of the overall map that Israel sees in front of itself. Then I come to your question on Jordan. I am concerned, though mildly so. The situation in Jordan, the basics are very well known. There are about 60% of Palestinian origin, 40% of Bedouin or Hashemite origin. And the balance was maintained for many years, ever since the creation of the Kingdom of Jordan. And the new developments in the Middle East threaten this delicate balance, and the King Abdullah II, has to maneuver very carefully. He's speaking about reforms. In my view, what he is willing to do in terms of the political reforms is not sufficient. But this is a matter of negotiations, and if he can negotiate with those who ask for the reforms, plausible,
Brotherhood,
mostly the Brotherhood, but not necessarily only.
There is
and he needs to also to receive, in my view, more than he gets now in terms of foreign aid, to shore up the economy and to be able to subsidize. Last week they have eliminated many of the subsidies, and this could cause real tensions, and they already brought out the people to the streets. And so the combination of some political reforms with more assistance could stabilize the situation in Jordan. But in the long run, Jordan will be affected not only by what happens in Jordan itself, but the other corners of the region.
Iraq, Syria,
any confrontation with Iran. And we have to remember, Jordan is a mirror of what happens between us and the Palestinians. Whatever happens on the western bank of the Jordan River reflected immediately on the eastern side.
But you point out, you sound very optimistic. You come across very optimistic, which is wonderful. I'm a bit more pessimist than you are, apparently. But, and here's where I want to touch on this, on your thesis. Basically, you say, you talk about Egypt needing aid, you talk about Jordan needing aid, and since I just went through a piece you wrote recently on the Arab Spring and the West last year. You cite there the International Monetary Fund's report that the Middle East non-oil producing countries, namely Egypt and Jordan and some others, need for the next 3 years, actually this year included $50 billion a year for aid.
Right.
And a fraction of that has been pledged, not delivered, pledged. And pledges in the Middle East are still that, pledges. Do you really think that the West, the United States, Europe, through the World Bank, through the international economic institutions, can deliver?
Very difficult. When you look at the situation in the United States, when you look at the euro crisis, you understand that the only real source available is the oil-producing countries, the Arab oil-producing countries. And some of them stand up to commitments and to the situation.
But $50 billion a year?
The situation is far from, the actual disbursement is far from that. But you see, the Saudis do understand the severity of the situation. They did give money to a number of Arab states, including in their own neighborhood, Bahrain and Oman, and Egypt and Jordan. Not enough, and eventually they will have to put their hands deeper in their pockets if they want to salvage the regime and to prevent further destabilization on economic issues, because they cannot help the political developments, but they can, as the case is in Egypt, in Jordan and in Egypt. If there is more money injected into economic projects, in job creation projects,
this is where will the money go to is also very important.
And if the money doesn't necessarily, or all of it goes to increasing salaries, which is the tendency of these governments to do, there is a possibility of stabilizing. We have to remember also, and we should discuss it sometime, the whole issue of natural resources. And we are now on the doorstep of a new era, at least in the Eastern Mediterranean. Lebanon, Israel, Palestinians, Egyptians stand to profit from large discoveries of natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. And if they can overcome the political strife, the political differences, and the different claims, they stand to certainly change their economic situation and fortunes. And if they know how to invest this smartly, there is a possibility to look ahead with some optimism.
But with a lot of ifs involved. We'll take another break before Omer will start hitting me.
IDC Radio, 106.2 FM.
Risk, the Global Challenge, with Tommy Steiner.
Welcome back to Risk. I'm here today with Ambassador Dr. Oded Eran. We talked about the Middle East a bit. Actually, we did a lot of disservice to talking a bit about the Middle East. But then we have to go on to talk about our relations with the United States and the U.S. role in this region. We mentioned just before we broke the financial situation in the United States. It's having to deal with other issues. We haven't yet mentioned the other issue, which is the pivot to Asia. It seems that the United States is disengaging from the Middle East. Where does that put us?
It puts us in a situation where we have to consider the ways of maintaining our relations with the United States, both the military defense ones and the political, because both are very important. In my view, the United States, and I agree with your assumption, the United States is withdrawing. The United States dependency on energy from the Middle East is almost
it isn't dependent.
There's no dependence, and even Europe is less and less dependent on Arab oil. It's now more a dependency on Russian gas, but
that's another problem.
But the United States is withdrawing. We've seen it in Iraq. We've seen it in Afghanistan. We have seen it even in other parts closer to us in the Middle East. And the focus is shifting to the Far East, especially China. Now, in my view, the way to maintain the United States influence in the region is by creating an environment, political environment, in which the United States can play a role. And it brings me to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you can bet on it, that if Obama is re-elected, or even if Romney is elected, the United States will be asked one way or another to come back to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. In my view, the Israeli government should initiate some sort of a concept of how to deal for itself, and then try and sell it to the United States. Not necessarily a comprehensive solution at this time because of the shifting sands in the region, the shifting sands in the Palestinian camp, whether they will have elections, they won't have elections, the relative powers between Hamas and Fatah. And so we cannot speak about comprehensive. But if we come with a partial plan dealing with some of the issues, and we can convince the United States about our seriousness and our willingness, and they can see the merits of this initiative, I think that this will be a very constructive step on our side and could maintain the U.S. influence, which is of utmost importance to Israel in the region. But we need to come out with this.
I assume that this is the basis of what you proposed last week at the annual conference of your institute when you presented the teamwork on U.S.-Israel relations. Actually, at least on one issue, we don't differ that much, because when we wrote here, actually a year ago, the foreign policy section for the Herzliya conference, we wrote that specifically that the United States is getting more engaged in Asia. We went to another step, and we argued there along the same lines, more or less, that Israel needs to take more on its own shoulders to make sure that the United States remains engaged in the region. And by the way, the same applies for the other U.S. allies in this region. The only question marks I have is whether we have the leadership in Israel among the Palestinians and among the other U.S. allies in the region to pull this off, because I have my doubts in this respect.
Yeah. Well, you're right to have your doubts for the time being. Nobody, not in the United States, not in Europe, not among the Palestinians, not even among the Israelis, there's no one speaking about a partial plan to move towards the two-state solution. I think that this sort of initiative is also very important in terms of our relations with the Jewish community in the United States. I think that there is a slight erosion there, though not always reflected in the polls. The Israeli position and stature in overall community, Jewish population, and in the general population of the United States is still very high. But you can see on the liberal side some encroachment and some signs that not all is perfect, and so the whole relationship, not only with the U.S. administration, but also with the Jewish community, with certain segments of the population, the Hispanics, and the Afro-Asian and the Afro-Americans. No, you have also the Asian community, which is now 5%. And you can see the rise of the numbers of representatives in the U.S. Congress, House of Representatives. And so we need to do this not only for ourselves, not only for the Middle East, but also for the relations with certain parts of the U.S. population.
I know you mentioned the liberal camp, and I assume that you followed the reports on blogs and other media related to, how I said, more liberal think tanks in Washington, which started sounding like, before, I'll be mentioning Europe in a second, they started to sound rather European in the sense that they are accepting lock, stock and barrel the Palestinian narrative. It has reached the United States. It's in the liberal camp now.
Right. And we should be concerned with this, although there's a tendency to fall into this syndrome of the skies are falling over the relations with Israel, and we I've watched the relations for now 30 years, and
We are still a strategic asset?
we are. I would put it differently. I would say that we are strategic partners, and so there is an important difference, because when you say a strategic asset, then you run into questions. So, General Petraeus represents it, or if a person in his position claims that
We are a liability.
we to some extent we are a liability, then obviously that's not the right question to ask, and not to receive this answer. So I would say that yes, we are strategic partners, and this is very important. And when the United States looks at the region, we cannot avoid looking at the Israeli relevance and importance. And you don't measure it by Israel offering a base for U.S. planes to attack in Libya or elsewhere in the future in the Middle East. This is not necessarily the only prism. You need to also look at the political environment, the geostrategics of the region, and therefore I think that we are partners.
And we're back. Welcome back to Risk. I'm Tommy Steiner, and I'm with Ambassador Dr. Oded Eran today. And after talking about the United States, we cannot but leave out Europe from this discussion. You served in Europe more years than I think you wished actually to serve in the last round, but there is a debate, I think, in the Israeli government between some people who say that, well, Israel has lost Europe, and those who say, well, our relations with Europe still can be, salvaged. Where do you stand on this?
Let me start with a very almost bombastic statement. I think that Europe is Israel's hinterland. We don't have the ability, even in the future, to be associated in the Middle East. Not economically, not culturally, not religiously. We cannot, even if we wanted, and I'm not so sure that we do want, but so we need to associate ourselves with the bloc called, with the region called Europe. And I say that in spite of what we see now, the crisis, almost the possibility, I hope that it won't happen, the collapse of certain institutions in Europe. And for years I worked for a stronger association between Israel and Europe.
I remember.
I also remember this, and I say it very seriously. Now, you say that there are some in the Israeli government who say one thing, and unfortunately, I don't think that the Israeli government, or governments in plural, ever discussed strategically what Israel wants from Europe. What is our
end game?
I'm not so sure that I'm not aware.
As you pointed out at the beginning of the show today, we haven't had this discussion on anything. So why should we have one on Europe?
No, because there were, I think, many debates on our relations with the United States. I'm sure. But I'm not aware of any debate, strategic debate, on what do we want to see in our relations with Europe. And this is very important. Secondly, in spite of all its difficulties, Europe is our major trading partner. That in itself requires some sort of a debate. But I go beyond that. If you look at our research and development projects in the Middle East, in Israel, a lot is done with Europe. A lot is done through channeling money to the European budget on R&D. We are full members in this respect in the European Union.
only in this when it serves the European Union interest.
Right. Israel has been recognized as a leading country in R&D, was accepted. We pay our dues for membership in
it doesn't come
in the
for free,
program, and
true.
it comes back to the Israeli
And we even
institutions.
get some more money from that, actually.
Absolutely. So this is very important. But it goes beyond it. The Mediterranean environmental problems are similar in Spain, and they are similar in Haifa. And if you want, also in Alexandria and Beirut. And the European Union, on its side, should be more forthcoming and should try to bring all these Mediterranean neighbors into the decision shaping, not necessarily the decision making. I'm not so sure that we want to be members of the EU, even if the door had been open to us. I'm not so sure, but at least we should be in a better situation to bring our point of view on many issues which relate to us. If it is the North Sea, we don't need to be there. But if it is the Mediterranean, it's certainly relevant to us. And so the two sides, Israel and other countries in the region, if they do so wish, and the EU have to work on stronger relations between them.
But I think that the basic problem, and you can compare Europe to the United States for a moment, even though the comparison is problematic, I can see that. The problem we have with Europe basically is that our relations are majorly determined by the Arab-Israeli conflict and their perception of the conflict. Whereas when it comes to the United States, we have a broader relationship that goes beyond the conflict. So that, I think, is one of the basic problems in our relations with Europe. And the Europeans, ever since, I think, the 1980s, since the Venice Declaration, have focused their attention only, in a sense, European-Israeli relations have been a barometer for advancing the peace process. And in fact, we've just given the Palestinians hold hostage our relations with Europe.
Yeah, I agree with you, although I think that the comparison with the United States is too confusing, between Europe and the United States is too confusing to base a discussion on this. But I agree with you. The Europeans are themselves contributing to the situation where they block progress in the relations, bilateral relations with Israel, because some countries, some segments in the political.
But the European Parliament.
I was going to say the European Parliament itself is taking also, not by the majority, by the minority in Parliament, which blocks the progress and the ratification of many agreements with Israel, which are beneficial to Europe and not only to Israel. And so, yes, the Europeans have to separate themselves. And I think that all the three mechanisms that Europe created to deal with the neighborhood, the Mediterranean neighborhood, have proven failure. There's a need to find something else which will be tailored to the individual needs of Tunisia, of Egypt, and of Israel.
They could learn something from NATO and its new partnership policy, I think.
Right.
But just before and I know that Omar's already indicated, I have one thing. Is there a way to try and reduce the obsession of Europe with the peace process, or it's a lost case?
Well, it's a two-way street, I think. It has to be a dual effort, both European and ours. If we come back to the idea of having an interim, a partial initiative taken by Israel on the road to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this will also help our relations with Europe. And if the Europeans adopt such a similar idea or adopt this initiative and agree to go to work together on this issue, we can find a way. By the way, in the short history of the last 10, 15 years, we have seen the Europeans coming into the partial solutions on the border between Gaza and Egypt and Sinai when we pulled out from the Gaza Strip on training security forces in UNIFIL off the coast of Lebanon. And so there are many examples of Israel's willingness to take the Europeans in some sort of a role. So
that they wouldn't be only payers, but players.
Absolutely.
Oh, yes. I want to thank you for coming, for taking the time to come out here to Herzliya today, and for joining us. I want to thank our producer and technician Omer Kedar, our music editor Barak Chaimovich, the video technicians Sasha Mityakov and Neil Peleg. Thank you for joining me on IDC Radio 106.2 FM. Ambassador Dr. Oded Eran, thank you. And he asked that the last song today will be Daniel by John Elton. So
it was my favorite.
Well, we'll listen to it. Thank you very much.